The Andorians watched in pity as Earth's nuclear arsenal barely scarred their plasma shields. Shields which now flickered with an ominous green glow as they prepared to gut humanity's puny defenses like a fish. Lawrence Roberts's calloused hands moved with practiced precision, slotting the final components of an ancient projectile rifle into place. The weapon, a treasured family heirloom, had seen humanity through its first tentative steps into the stars, and now, it seemed, would witness its last. A holographic display cast a pallid glow across Lawrence's hardened features, the news anchor's voice trembling as she recounted the Andorians' relentless advance. Colony after colony had fallen before the insectoid warriors, their populations subjugated or simply eradicated. Earth's once mighty fleets, their hulls now pitted and scarred, strained to hold back the Andorian tide. Outdated technology and hesitant leadership had left humanity vulnerable, a fact not lost on the aliens' supreme commander. In a transmission that had gone viral across the extranet, Warlord Hydra sneered at a human captive, his mandibles clicking with cruel amusement. "Your nukes are as primitive to us as stone axes to you," he chittered. "Surrender now, and perhaps we shall be merciful." A chime tore Lawrence from his troubled thoughts, an urgent holomessage from SDF Command. The Andorians had entered the Epsilon Eridani system, making a beeline for Arcadia Prime. Lawrence's ship, the only vessel within range, was to buy time for the colony's evacuation, no matter the cost. The unspoken truth hung in the air like a funeral shroud. This was a suicide mission, plain and simple. Lawrence's jaw set as he rose to his feet. If this was to be his final act in defense of Earth, so be it. Humanity would not go quietly into the night. He strode towards the armory with purpose, the rifle slung over his shoulder. "Laugh while you can, Hydrus," he growled under his breath. "We'll see who's smiling when I ram a nuke down your goddamn throat." Klaxons blared through the SDF Reliant as Lawrence and his crew raced to their battle stations. Sergeant Hawkins, a grizzled veteran with a scar running down his left cheek, slapped a fresh power cell into his plasma rifle. "I've been waiting for a chance to give those Andorian bastards a taste of their own medicine," he growled. Dr. Patel, his hands shaking slightly as he tapped at his console, glanced up at Hawkins. "Let's just hope this modified warhead does the trick. If my calculations are off by even a fraction." Lawrence clapped a hand on Patel's shoulder. "You're the best damn engineer in the fleet, Doc. If anyone can make this work, it's you." In the armory, Lawrence punched in the access code to a heavily reinforced locker. Inside sat the fruits of his labor these past months. A nuclear warhead, its casing etched with intricate modifications. He hefted the device, feeling its weight in his hands. "Patel, I need you to integrate this into a torpedo casing. Make sure the detonator is synced to Hawkins' weapons console." The engineer nodded, his jaw set as he took the warhead and hurried off to the torpedo bay. On the bridge, Lawrence settled into the captain's chair, his eyes fixed on the view screen. Arcadia Prime hung before them, its verdant surface marred by the flashes of orbital bombardment. Swarms of Andorian fighters buzzed around the planet like angry hornets, strafing the fleeing civilian transports. And there, at the center of the chaos, loomed the Kittinus Blade. Hydrus's flagship dwarfed the Reliant, its hull a nightmarish fusion of organic and mechanical components. But Lawrence had a plan. "Patel, status on that stealth system?" The engineer's voice crackled over the comm. "Online and fully operational, sir. We should be invisible to their sensors." Lawrence nodded grimly. "Good. Take us in, nice and slow. Hawkins, be ready on that trigger." The Reliant crept forward, slipping past the Andorian blockade like a ghost. Lawrence's hands tightened on the controls as they approached the Kittinus Blade, his eyes scanning for the thermal exhaust port that was their target. "There," he barked, pointing at a small glowing aperture near the base of the ship's reactor core. "Hawkins, lock on and—" A barrage of plasma fire suddenly erupted around them, the Reliant shuddering under the impacts. Warning lights flashed across the bridge consoles. "Shit, they've spotted us," Hawkins yelled. "Stealth system must have failed." Lawrence gritted his teeth, wrenching the ship into a dizzying spiral to evade the incoming fire. The Reliant groaned under the strain, its hull plates buckling. "Keep it together, girl," Lawrence muttered, patting the console. "Just a little longer." Plasma bolts sizzled past the view screen as Lawrence pushed the ship to its limits, bobbing and weaving through the Andorian onslaught. The seconds stretched into eternity as they hurtled towards the chitinous blade, the thermal exhaust port growing larger in their sights. Hawkins' finger hovered over the torpedo launch button, his brow slick with sweat. Lawrence lined up the shot, the crosshairs dancing across the screen. In a moment of preternatural calm, he drew in a deep breath, uttering a silent prayer to the cosmos. Then, with a roar of defiance, he slammed his fist down on the console. The modified nuclear torpedo shot forth from the Reliant's launch tube, streaking through the void on a collision course with the chitinous blade. Its stealth casing, a marvel of human ingenuity, allowed it to slip past the Andorian flagship's formidable point defense systems undetected. On the bridge of the chitinous blade, Warlord Hydrus watched the approaching torpedo with a mix of amusement and disdain. "Pathetic," he chittered, his mandibles clicking in a cruel approximation of laughter. "The humans think they can harm us with their primitive weapons? Let them see the futility of their efforts." But as the torpedo closed in, Hydrus's laughter turned to shock and disbelief. The projectile, rather than impacting harmlessly against the chitinous blade's plasma shields, found its mark, the thermal exhaust port near the ship's reactor core. In a blinding flash of nuclear fire, the torpedo detonated, setting off a cataclysmic chain reaction that tore through the Andorian vessel. The once mighty chitinous blade was reduced to a shattered husk in mere seconds, its twisted remains drifting lifelessly through the void. On the bridge of the Reliant, Lawrence and his crew braced themselves as the shockwave from the explosion slammed into their ship. Sparks flew from overloaded consoles, and the deck pitched violently beneath their feet. But the Reliant held together, its hull scorched and its shields depleted but still intact. As the blinding glare of the explosion faded, Lawrence surveyed the battlefield, with a mixture of triumph and grim determination. Across the Andorian fleet, confusion and panic had set in, as the aliens realized their flagship had been destroyed. "Now's our chance," Lawrence barked, his voice cutting through the chaos. "All human forces launch a coordinated counterattack. We've got them on the ropes." Sergeant Hawkins needed no further prompting. With a feral grin, he led a daring assault on the Andorian fighter swarms, his expert marksmanship and tactical brilliance turning the tide of the battle. The human fighters, emboldened by the destruction of the chitinous blade, fought with renewed vigor, their weapons finding their marks with deadly precision. In the Reliance engine room, Dr. Patel worked frantically to keep the ship's systems operational, his hands a blur as he jury-rigged repairs on the fly. Sparks showered down around him as the ship took heavy damage, but he didn't flinch, his focus unwavering. As the battle raged on, a garbled transmission crackled through the Reliance comm system. Lawrence leaned in, his brow furrowing as he strained to make out the words through the static. "Hydrus survived a planetfall and leading ground assault at Capital City." Lawrence's blood ran cold. Somehow, against all odds, the Andorian warlord had survived the destruction of his ship. And now he was on Arcadia Prime, personally leading a ground assault on the colony's capital. Hawkins nodded curtly, his eyes gleaming with the thrill of battle. "I'm taking a strike team planetside," Lawrence continued, his voice steely with resolve. "We're going to confront Hydrus directly and end this once and for all." With grim determination, Lawrence gathered a squad of his most skilled soldiers and boarded a dropship, rocketing towards the planet's surface and into the heart of the battle. As they descended through the atmosphere, the once peaceful streets of the capital came into view, now a war-torn hellscape of rubble and flames. The dropship touched down amidst the chaos, and Lawrence and his team sprang into action. They fought their way through the Andorian ground forces, their superior tactics and weaponry proving more than a match for the insectoid warriors. As they closed in on Hydrus's position, Lawrence felt a sense of anticipation building in his gut. He knew that this confrontation would decide the fate of not just Arcadia Prime, but perhaps all of humanity. The blast doors of the fortified compound shuddered under the impact of Lawrence's breaching charges. With a deafening roar, the reinforced metal gave way, and the strike team poured into the breach. Pulse rifle fire lit up the darkened corridors in a strobing display of deadly energy. Lawrence led the charge, his weapons spitting plasma bolts at the Andorian elite guard. The insectoid warriors returned fire, their own weapons carving molten furrows into the walls and floor. "Push forward," Lawrence barked, lobbing a plasma grenade into a cluster of Andorians. The explosion tore through their ranks, scattering chitin and ichor. Amidst the chaos, Lawrence caught a glimpse of Hydrus. The Andorian warlord's once pristine exoskeleton was cracked and scorched, his regal bearing diminished. Yet even wounded, Hydrus radiated an aura of menace, his compound eyes glinting with malevolent intelligence. For a moment, their gazes locked across the battlefield, a silent acknowledgement of their shared destiny. Then Hydrus turned and retreated deeper into the compound, his elite guard closing ranks behind him. "I'm going after Hydrus," Lawrence growled. "Sergeant, hold the line here." "Give him hell, sir," came the reply, punctuated by the staccato bark of pulse rifle fire. Lawrence plunged into the labyrinthine depths of the compound, his rifle sweeping the shadows. He could sense Hydrus's presence, the Andorian's malevolent aura permeating the very air. Suddenly, a blur of movement, Hydrus lunged from the darkness, his razor-sharp claws slashing at Lawrence's face. The human barely managed to parry the blow with his rifle, the force of the impact sending him staggering back. The two bitter enemies clashed in a brutal hand-to-hand engagement, trading blows amidst the twisting corridors. Lawrence's raw strength and combat experience were pitted against Hydrus's lightning-fast reflexes and cunning intellect. Pulse rifle fire lit up the darkened corridors in a strobing display of deadly energy. Lawrence led the charge, his weapons spitting plasma bolts at the Andorian elite guard. The insectoid warriors returned fire, their own weapons carving molten furrows into the walls and floor. "Push forward," Lawrence barked, lobbing a plasma grenade into a cluster of Andorians. The explosion tore through their ranks, scattering chitin and ichor. Amidst the chaos, Lawrence caught a glimpse of Hydrus. The Andorian warlord's once pristine exoskeleton was cracked and scorched, his regal bearing diminished. Yet even wounded, Hydrus radiated an aura of menace, his compound eyes glinting with malevolent intelligence. For a moment, their gazes locked across the battlefield, a silent acknowledgement of their shared destiny. Then Hydrus turned and retreated deeper into the compound, his elite guard closing ranks behind him. "I'm going after Hydrus," Lawrence growled. "Sergeant, hold the line here." "Give him hell, sir," came the reply, punctuated by the staccato bark of pulse rifle fire. Lawrence plunged into the labyrinthine depths of the compound, his rifle sweeping the shadows. He could sense Hydrus's presence, the Andorian's malevolent aura permeating the very air. Suddenly, a blur of movement, Hydrus lunged from the darkness, his razor-sharp claws slashing at Lawrence's face. The human barely managed to parry the blow with his rifle, the force of the impact sending him staggering back. The two bitter enemies clashed in a brutal hand-to-hand engagement, trading blows amidst the twisting corridors. Lawrence's raw strength and combat experience were pitted against Hydrus's lightning-fast reflexes and cunning intellect. Claws raked across armor, drawing sparks and blood. Fists pounded against chitin, cracking and splintering the hardened plates. The air grew thick with the stench of sweat and alien ichor. Both warriors were pushed to their limits, their armor battered and blood-stained, yet neither willing to yield. They fought with a savage intensity, fueled by a hatred that transcended mere battlefield animosity. Hydrus lured Lawrence deeper into the compound, leading him through a labyrinth of twisting corridors and shadowed chambers. The Andorian warlord moved with a predatory grace, always staying one step ahead of his human adversary. Finally, they burst into a massive central chamber, and Lawrence stopped dead in his tracks, his blood running cold at the sight before him. A towering Andorian machine dominated the room, its surface pulsing with malevolent energy. Writhing cables and pulsating conduits snaked across its frame, feeding into a central core that glowed with an eerie, sickly light. Hydras's mandibles twisted into a cruel approximation of a smile. "Behold, human," he chittered, "the instrument of your species' destruction." The Andorian warlord's words dripped with venom as he revealed the machine's true nature. A doomsday weapon capable of obliterating entire star systems. Arcadia Prime, he gloated, was merely a test run for its devastating power. Lawrence felt a rising tide of horror as the implications sank in. The stakes were even higher than he had imagined. The fate of not just Arcadia Prime, but countless worlds hung in the balance. With a roar of defiance, Lawrence launched himself at Hydras, their battle now raging in the shadow of the apocalyptic machine. Pulse rifle fire and plasma bursts lit up the chamber, scorching the twisted metal of the doomsday device. As they fought, the machine began to power up, its eerie glow intensifying with each passing second. The air thrummed with barely contained energy, setting Lawrence's teeth on edge. He knew he had to act quickly, not just to defeat Hydras, but to find a way to disable the doomsday weapon before it could be unleashed upon the galaxy. In a moment of desperate inspiration, Lawrence's gaze fell upon a vulnerability in the machine's structure, a pulsing, exposed power core. If he could just get close enough, he might be able to damage it and shut down the device. But Hydra stood between him and the core, the Andorian warlord sensing his intentions. With a chittering snarl, Hydrus interposed himself, his claws raised to strike. Lawrence's grip tightened on his pulse rifle, the weapon's stock slick with sweat and blood. He steeled himself for one final, all-or-nothing charge. This was his moment, his chance to end the threat of Hydrus and his apocalyptic weapon once and for all. With a primal roar of defiance, Lawrence leapt forward, ready to meet his destiny head-on. Lawrence feinted left, his pulse rifle held close to his chest. Hydrus lunged forward, mandibles snapping, but Lawrence pivoted at the last second. He slammed his shoulder into the Andorian's chest, using Hydrus's momentum to send him crashing into a nearby control panel. Sparks erupted from the shattered console, alarms blaring as the doomsday machine shuddered and groaned. Lawrence charged towards the pulsing power core, weaving through a maze of crackling conduits and shattered machinery. Energy blasts sizzled past his head, the machine's automated defenses trying to cut him down. Just as he reached for the core, Hydra slammed into him from behind. They grappled mere inches from the device's throbbing heart, chitons scraping against battle-scarred armor. Lawrence drove his fist into Hydrus's cracked exoskeleton, shattering the Andorian's left arm. Hydrus retaliated with a vicious headbutt, splitting Lawrence's helmet and sending stars dancing across his vision. The doomsday machine's core destabilized as they traded blows, arcs of energy lashing out and tearing through the chamber. Lawrence knew he had seconds, maybe less. He tackled Hydrus, sending them both crashing to the ground. They rolled across the debris-strewn floor, a tangle of limbs and shattered armor. Lawrence's fingers closed around a jagged piece of shrapnel. He drove it deep into Hydrus's thorax, the Andorian's scream gurgling as viscous green blood poured from the wound. With a final desperate effort, Lawrence wrenched himself free and staggered towards the power core. He raised his rifle, taking aim at the pulsing, unstable heart of the machine. A wet, rasping laugh echoed from behind him. Hydrus, barely clinging to life, spat blood-flecked words. "You think you've won, human? You're too late. The machine cannot be stopped. Your precious Earth will burn, along with the rest of your pathetic species." Lawrence hesitated, the weight of Hydrus's words hitting him like a physical blow. Then he steeled himself, a grim smile spreading across his blood-stained face. "Maybe," he growled, finger tightening on the trigger. "But if we burn, you burn with us." He fired, the plasma bolt striking the power core dead center. The machine screamed, the core rupturing in a blinding flash. The shockwave slammed into Lawrence, hurling him back. His world faded to black as the chamber collapsed, burying him and Hydrus beneath tons of twisted metal and shattered stone. Pain shot through Lawrence's body as consciousness slowly returned, the ringing in his ears gradually giving way to the distant rumble of explosions. The acrid stench of smoke filled his nostrils, and he coughed, wincing as his battered ribs protested the sudden movement. His vision swam as he blinked away the dust and debris, the dim light filtering through the cracks in the rubble that entombed him. With a grunt of effort, Lawrence began to dig himself out, ignoring the screaming agony in his muscles. His fingers scraped against jagged metal and shattered stone, tearing at his flesh. But he pushed on, driven by sheer force of will. Finally, he broke through to the surface, gasping for air as he pulled himself free of the wreckage. The scene that greeted him was one of utter devastation. The once imposing Andorian command center lay in ruins, reduced to a smoldering crater by the destruction of the Doomsday Machine. Twisted metal and shattered stone stretched as far as the eye could see, the remnants of the alien stronghold now little more than a blasted hellscape. Lawrence staggered to his feet, his legs threatening to give out beneath him. He scanned the wreckage, searching for any signs of life. A glint of metal caught his eye, and he stumbled towards it, hope and dread warring in his heart. There, half buried beneath a slab of concrete, lay the motionless form of Sergeant Hawkins. Lawrence dropped to his knees beside his fallen comrade, his trembling fingers searching for a pulse. For a moment, there was nothing. Then, a faint flutter beneath his fingertips. Hawkins was alive, if only barely. Lawrence moved on, his eyes straining against the smoke and dust. He found Dr. Patel next, the engineer's body pinned beneath a twisted girder. Patel's face was ashen, his breathing shallow, but he too clung to life. One by one, Lawrence located the survivors of his strike team. Some were wounded, their blood mingling with the ash and debris. Others lay still and silent, their eyes staring sightlessly at the ruined sky. Lawrence felt a twinge of grief for the fallen, but he pushed it aside. There would be time for mourning later. As he helped the last of the survivors to their feet, a sudden movement caught Lawrence's eye. From beneath a twisted heap of metal, a clawed hand emerged, followed by the broken, bleeding form of Hydrus. The Andorian warlord, his once proud exoskeleton now cracked and oozing viscous green ichor, dragged himself forward, his compound eyes burning with undimmed hatred. You think this is over?" Hydrus hissed, his voice a rasping whisper. Each word seemed to cost him dearly, bubbling past his mangled mandibles in a froth of blood. "This is only the beginning. My people will never stop. We will hunt you to the ends of the universe." Lawrence limped towards the fallen warlord, his rifle raised. He looked down at Hydrus, his eyes hard and cold. "You're right," he said, his voice steady despite the exhaustion that threatened to overwhelm him. "This isn't over, but as long as I'm breathing, as long as humanity still stands, we will fight, we will never stop fighting." Hydrus let out a rattling hiss, his claws scrabbling against the rubble as he tried to push himself upright. With a final defiant roar, he lunged at Lawrence, his razor-sharp talons slashing through the air. Hydrus crumpled to the ground, his body twitching once, twice, then lying still. Lawrence stood over the fallen warlord, his chest heaving with exertion. He turned to his surviving team members, his eyes filled with grim determination. "We need to get back to the Reliant," he said, his voice heavy with fatigue. "This battle may be won, but the war is far from over." The battered strike team picked their way through the ruins, supporting the wounded as they made their way back to the dropship. Each step was an agony, their bodies pushed beyond the limits of human endurance. As they stumbled up the ramp and into the waiting ship, Lawrence couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning of a much larger conflict. The Andorians, enraged by the loss of their warlord and the destruction of their doomsday weapon, would undoubtedly seek revenge. And with the revelation of the aliens' true intentions and the extent of their advanced technology, Lawrence knew that humanity must be prepared for an even greater fight ahead. The dropship lifted off, its engines straining as it clawed its way through the smoke-filled sky. Lawrence slumped against the bulkhead, his eyes drifting towards the viewport. Below, the war-torn landscape of Arcadia Prime stretched out before him, a testament to the brutal reality of the conflict that had engulfed the galaxy. The once verdant fields and gleaming cities of the colony lay in ruins, reduced to ash and rubble by the Andorian onslaught. The sight filled Lawrence with a profound sense of loss, a deep ache that settled in his chest and refused to abate. But even amidst the destruction, Lawrence could see the faint stirrings of hope. The scattered survivors of the colony, their faces streaked with dirt and blood, emerged from their hiding places, their eyes filled with a fierce determination. They had endured the unimaginable, had seen their homes and loved ones torn away, and yet still they stood, unbowed and unbroken. In that moment, Lawrence saw the true strength of the human spirit, the unwavering will to fight, to survive, to carry on in the face of even the darkest adversity. It was a flame that burned bright within every human heart, a light that could never be extinguished. And with that realization, Lawrence felt a renewed sense of purpose wash over him. He knew that the road ahead would be long and hard, that the battles to come would test the very limits of human courage and resolve. But he also knew that humanity would never stop fighting, would never surrender in the face of evil. As the dropship hurtled through the stars, carrying its battered cargo back to the waiting Reliant, Lawrence closed his eyes, a faint smile playing across his lips. The war was far from over, but with the strength of the human spirit at his back, he knew that anything was possible. The story would continue, the battle would rage on, but for now Lawrence allowed himself a moment of rest, secure in the knowledge that as long as humanity stood together, they could face whatever challenges lay ahead. As the Reliant's docking bay doors hissed open, Lawrence and his team stepped out into a cacophony of cheers and applause. The crew of the Reliant, their faces beaming with pride and relief, surged forward to greet their returning heroes. Sergeant Hawkins, his arm in a sling but his spirit unbroken, grinned as his comrades clapped him on the back. Dr. Patel, his face smudged with grease and his eyes heavy with exhaustion, managed a weary smile as he was embraced by his fellow engineers. For a moment, the weight of the battles they had fought and the losses they had suffered seemed to lift, replaced by a sense of camaraderie and shared triumph. Lawrence, his own wounds bandaged and his uniform still stained with the blood of his enemies, allowed himself a brief moment of respite, his heart swelling with pride at the bravery and dedication of his crew. But the moment was short-lived. As the crew began to disperse, an urgent chime cut through the air. "Captain Roberts, report to the bridge immediately. Priority message from Earth Command." Lawrence's jaw tightened. He knew that tone all too well, the clipped, tense voice of a commander bearing grim tidings. With a nod to his team, he strode towards the bridge, his boots ringing against the deck plates. On the bridge, Lawrence found his senior officers already gathered, their faces drawn and their eyes fixed on the view screen. As he took his place at the center of the room, the screen flickered to life, revealing the haggard face of Admiral Jameson, the Supreme Commander of Earth's forces. "Captain Roberts," Jameson began, his voice heavy with fatigue and strain, "I'll cut straight to the chase. The Andorian Empire has launched a massive counterattack. They're enraged by the loss of Hydrus and the destruction of their doomsday weapon, and they're out for blood." Lawrence's heart sank as Jameson outlined the scale of the Andorian offensive. A fleet of warships far larger and more powerful than anything humanity had faced before was sweeping across the galaxy, targeting human colonies and outposts with ruthless efficiency. Earth's forces, already stretched thin and reeling from the previous battles, were vastly outnumbered and outgunned. "We're ordering a full mobilization of all available forces," Jameson continued, his eyes boring into Lawrence's. "But we need more than just numbers. We need a game changer. And that's where you come in." The Admiral's words hung in the air, heavy with implication. Lawrence leaned forward, his heart pounding in his chest. "The Reliant is one of the few ships to have faced the Andorians and emerged victorious," Jameson said, his voice taking on a note of urgency. "We need you to lead a daring raid on the Andorians' main supply lines, cut off their access to vital resources, throw their offensive into disarray." buy us time to regroup and mount a coordinated defense. Lawrence's mind raced as he absorbed the enormity of the task before him. He knew that the stakes had never been higher, that the fate of humanity itself rested on the success of this mission. But he also knew that he had the best damn crew in the fleet behind him, men and women who had already proven their mettle in the face of impossible odds. "We'll get it done, Admiral," Lawrence said, his voice steady and sure. "The Andorians won't know what hit them." As the transmission ended, Lawrence turned to his crew, his gaze sweeping over the faces of the men and women he had come to know and trust with his life. "You heard the Admiral," he said, his voice ringing with determination. "We have a mission, and failure is not an option." The crew erupted into a chorus of affirmations, their voices fierce and resolute. They knew the odds they faced, the dangers that lay ahead, but they also knew that they were the best of the best, and that together they could achieve the impossible. As the Reliant set course for the Andorian supply lines, Lawrence gathered his senior officers for a briefing. In the dimly lit conference room, he laid out the plan, a series of precise coordinated strikes on key Andorian supply depots and transport hubs, designed to cripple their war machine and throw their offensive into disarray. "It's a risky gambit," Lawrence acknowledged, his eyes scanning the faces of his officers, "but it's our best shot at turning the tide of this war, and I have faith in each and every one of you to see it through." The officers nodded, their faces set with grim determination. They knew the weight of the responsibility that rested on their shoulders, but they were ready to bear it. As the briefing concluded and the officers dispersed to their duties, Lawrence felt a hand on his shoulder. He turned to see Sergeant Hawkins, his face lined with the scars of battle, but his eyes bright with purpose. "We're with you, sir," Hawkins said, his voice rough but sincere. "To the end." Lawrence clasped the sergeant's hand, a silent acknowledgement of the bond they shared. He knew that he could count on Hawkins, on all of his crew, to give their all in the battles to come. As the Reliant hurtled through the void, her engines thrumming with barely contained power, the crew threw themselves into their preparations with a fervor born of desperation and determination. In the engineering bay, Dr. Patel and his team worked around the clock, coaxing every last ounce of performance from the ship's systems. They repaired battle damage, upgraded weapons and shields, tweaked the engines for maximum speed and maneuverability. In the training room, Sergeant Hawkins and the strike team ran drill after punishing drill, honing their skills and their teamwork to a razor's edge. They simulated every possible scenario, every contingency, determined to be ready for whatever the Andorians threw at them. And on the bridge, Lawrence pored over intelligence reports and sensor data, mapping out the intricacies of the Andorian supply network, searching for weaknesses to exploit. Every scrap of information was precious, every detail a potential key to victory. As the Reliant neared its target, a palpable tension settled over the ship. The crew moved about their duties with a focused intensity, their faces set and their eyes hard. They knew that the fate of humanity hung in the balance, that the success or failure of their mission could determine the course of the war. On the bridge, Lawrence stood before the view screen, his gaze fixed on the stars that streamed past. He felt the weight of command settle on his shoulders, the burden of responsibility for the lives of his crew and the fate of his species. But he also felt a fierce pride, a deep and abiding faith in the men and women who stood beside him. They had already accomplished the impossible, had stared down the Andorian war machine and emerged victorious. And now, as they raced towards their next great challenge, Lawrence knew that they would do so again. No matter the odds, no matter the cost, they would fight on. For Earth, for humanity, for the future. Lawrence's eyes hardened as he stared out at the vast expanse of space before him, his jaw set with unwavering resolve. He knew that the road ahead would be long and treacherous, that the battles to come would test the very limits of their courage and their strength. But he also knew that they would rise to meet those challenges, that they would fight with every ounce of skill and determination they possessed. They were the best of the best, the proud defenders of humanity, and they would not fail. The Reliant surged forward, her engines roaring with power as she dove headlong into the unknown. And on her bridge, Captain Lawrence Roberts stood tall and unwavering, ready to face whatever dangers lay ahead. Ready to lead his crew, his ship, and his species to victory, no matter the cost. The Reliant's hull shuddered as the ship dropped out of warp, the massive Andorian supply depot looming before them. In the armory, Lawrence and his strike team suited up, their state-of-the-art combat exoskeletons humming to life. The sleek, black armor encased their bodies, enhancing their strength, speed, and durability to superhuman levels. "Remember the plan," Lawrence said, his voice filtered through the exoskeleton's comm system. "We get in, plant the charges, and get out, quick and clean." The team nodded, their faces set with grim determination. They boarded the cloaked dropship, the vessel's advanced stealth technology rendering it all but invisible to Andorian sensors. They moved through the shadows, their exoskeletons' matte black finish blending seamlessly with the darkness. With surgical precision, they infiltrated the depot, planting explosive charges at key structural points and sabotaging vital equipment. But as they prepared to exfiltrate, a sudden alarm pierced the air. Red lights flashed and klaxons blared as the depot's security systems detected the intrusion. "Shit!" Sergeant Hawkins cursed, his exoskeleton-enhanced fingers flying over his rifle's controls. "We've been made." Andorian warriors swarmed the facility, their chitinous armor glinting in the harsh light. Plasma rifles blazed as they advanced on the strike team's position, the air crackling with deadly energy. Lawrence and his team met the onslaught head-on, their exoskeletons absorbing the brunt of the alien firepower. Enhanced servos whined as they dodged and weaved, returning fire with devastating precision. They fought their way through the depot in a deadly dance of close-quarters combat. Armored fists shattered chitin and cybernetic limbs with bone-crushing force, while plasma bolts seared flesh and scorched metal. As they battled towards the extraction point, Lawrence's enhanced vision caught a glimpse of a familiar figure among the Andorian ranks. A massive warrior, his carapace scarred and pitted, barked orders to his troops, a gleaming cybernetic arm flexing with hydraulic power. "Krytos," Lawrence growled, recognizing Hydras's former second-in-command. The Andorian's compound eyes fixed on Lawrence, burning with hatred and bloodlust. Lawrence knew that taking out Krytos could throw the Andorians into disarray, but getting to him would be no easy task. The strike team fought their way through the depot, leaving a trail of shattered bodies and smoldering wreckage in their wake. They reached the extraction point, the dropship waiting just beyond the depot's perimeter. But Krytos and his elite guard stood between them and escape, the Andorian commander's cybernetic arm glinting with deadly promise. Lawrence and Krytos clashed at the center of the chaos, their armored forms locked in a brutal duel. Enhanced fists slammed against reinforced chitin, the impact sending shockwaves through the air. Even with his exoskeleton's augmented strength, Lawrence found himself matched by Krytos's raw power and skill. The Andorian's cybernetic arm lashed out with piston-driven force, denting Lawrence's armor and driving the breath from his lungs. Around them, the strike team battled desperately against the tide of Andorian reinforcements. Plasma bolts and shattered chitin filled the air as the humans fought for their lives. As Krytos pressed his advantage, Lawrence's enhanced senses caught a flicker of movement, a subtle tell in the Andorian's cybernetic arm. With lightning reflexes, he lunged forward, his armored hand clamping down on the limb's exposed circuitry. A pulse of electromagnetic energy surged from Lawrence's gauntlet, shorting out the delicate components within Krytos's arm. The Andorian stumbled, the limb spasming and twitching as it malfunctioned. Seizing the moment, Lawrence drove his fist into Krytos's unprotected face, the blow shattering the Andorian's mandibles and sending him crashing to the ground. The commander lay still, his cybernetic arm sparking and twitching feebly. "Fall back," Lawrence roared, his voice cutting through the din of battle. "To the dropship now." The strike team disengaged, fighting a desperate rearguard action as they raced towards the waiting vessel. Behind them, The depot's charges detonated, the explosions tearing through the facility in a chain reaction of destruction. Lawrence and his team leaped aboard the dropship, the hatch slamming shut behind them as the vessel rocketed into the sky. The shockwave from the depot's destruction buffeted the ship, alarms shrieking as the pilot fought to maintain control. But the dropship held together, speeding away from the burning ruins of the depot and into the night sky. Lawrence slumped against the bulkhead, his exoskeleton systems whirring as they cooled and recalibrated. One supply depot down, but many more to go. The Reliant and her crew pressed on, determined to strike at the heart of the Andorian war machine. The battle had been won, but the war was far from over. The Reliant streaked through the void, her engines thrumming with barely contained power. On the bridge, Lawrence pored over the encrypted transmission from Earth Command, his brow furrowed in concentration. The intercepted Andorian communications painted a grim picture. The aliens were developing a new, even more devastating version of the doomsday weapon they'd destroyed on Arcadia Prime. If completed, it could mean the end of humanity and its allies. "We can't let that happen," Lawrence muttered, his voice hard with determination. He turned to his crew, his eyes blazing with resolve. "We have our orders. We find this weapon and we destroy it, no matter the cost." Using the intel gathered from the captured Andorian supply depots, they managed to pinpoint the likely location of the weapons research facility, a heavily fortified base on a remote, inhospitable moon. Lawrence set course, the Reliant's engines surging as they accelerated towards their target. But as they approached the moon, the proximity alarms blared to life. On the view screen, a massive Andorian fleet materialized, their ships bristling with weapons, and at their head, a familiar vessel, the flagship of Krytos, the Andorian commander they'd faced before. "Looks like he survived our last encounter," Hawkins growled, his hands flying over the weapons console, "and he's out for blood." Lawrence's grip tightened on the controls. "Then let's give him a fight he won't forget." The space around the moon erupted into a vicious battle, plasma bolts and missiles crisscrossing the void. Lawrence pushed the Reliant to her limits, weaving through the enemy formations with daring precision. The ship shuddered under the onslaught, alarms wailing as her shield strained to absorb the punishment. But Lawrence's skills were unmatched. With a series of deft maneuvers, he managed to punch through the Andorian lines, making a desperate run for the moon's surface. Behind them, Krytos's flagship broke off from the main fleet, pursuing with single-minded determination. "Brace for atmospheric entry," Lawrence barked, his knuckles white on the controls. The Reliant plunged into the moon's thin atmosphere, her hull glowing red-hot from the friction. In the cargo bay, Lawrence's strike team prepared for a hot drop, their exoskeletons barely cooled from the last engagement. They checked their weapons, grim determination etched on their faces. The ship shuddered as Lawrence brought her down hard, dust billowing as they touched down near the Andorian research facility. The strike team hit the ground running, quickly establishing a defensive perimeter. But Krytos was right behind them, his own elite warriors deploying in force. Within moments, the barren landscape erupted into a brutal ground battle, the crack of pulse rifles and the sizzle of plasma bolts filling the air. Lawrence led the charge, his exoskeleton enhanced speed and strength, allowing him to plow through the Andorian defenses. His team followed close behind, engaging in vicious close-quarters combat with the alien warriors and researchers. They breached the facility's perimeter, fighting their way deeper into the complex. In the chaos, Lawrence caught a glimpse of their target, the new doomsday weapon, a pulsing, malevolent device that seemed to warp reality itself. He knew they had to destroy it, but Krytos stood in their way, his cybernetic arm gleaming and his eyes burning with hatred. The two warriors clashed amidst the whirring machinery and crackling energy fields, their battle a dance of deadly precision. Around them, Lawrence's team planted explosive charges, preparing to reduce the facility to rubble. But Krytos was relentless, his enhanced strength and speed pushing Lawrence to his limits. Even with his exoskeleton's enhancements, Lawrence found himself losing ground, the Andorians' blows raining down like hammers. In a moment of desperation, Lawrence made a gamble. He lured Krytos closer to the pulsing heart of the doomsday weapon, then slammed his fist onto his gauntlet, activating a localized EMP charge. The pulse of disruptive energy surged through Krytos' cybernetic systems, causing the Andorian to stagger, his defenses momentarily compromised. Lawrence seized his chance. With a flurry of precise strikes, he drove Krytos to his knees, then spun towards the doomsday weapon's control panel. His armored fist slammed into the interface, initiating an irreversible overload sequence. Alarms blared, and warning lights flashed as the facility began to shake itself apart. Lawrence and his team raced for the exit, fighting through the last pockets of Andorian resistance. They burst from the complex, sprinting for the Reliant as the ground heaved and buckled beneath their feet. They barely made it aboard before the research base exploded in a blinding flash, the shockwave slamming into the Reliant and sending her lurching towards the stars. On the bridge, Lawrence slumped into his chair, his breath coming in ragged gasps. Lawrence's jaw tightened as he absorbed the news. The Reliant and her crew were needed back home, for the fight of their lives and the fate of humanity. He turned to his helmsman, his eyes hard with resolve. "Set course for Earth, maximum speed. It's time to end this once and for all." The Reliant tore through the void, its engines straining as Lawrence pushed them to their limits. The ship vibrated around him, the deck plates shuddering beneath his feet as they raced towards Earth. On the view screen, the blue-green world grew larger by the second, a beacon of hope amidst the darkness of space. But as they approached the solar system, the scene that greeted them was one of utter chaos. The remnants of the Andorian fleet, a ragtag collection of battered ships held together by sheer determination, were locked in a brutal slugging match with Earth's defenses. At the center of the alien formation, a massive dreadnought loomed, its hull bristling with weapons. The human fleet, bolstered by reinforcements from allied races, fought with grim determination. Plasma bolts and missiles crisscrossed the void, filling the blackness of space with bursts of light and fire. But even with their increased numbers, the human forces were hard-pressed to hold the line. The Andorians' superior firepower and relentless aggression were taking a heavy toll. Lawrence gripped the arms of his command chair, his knuckles white. "Bring us in, Helm. We've got to take some of the heat off our forces." The Reliant dove into the fray, weaving through the chaos of the battle with a grace that belied its battered condition. Lawrence's eyes flicked across the tactical display, seeking out weaknesses in the Andorian formation. "There," he said, stabbing a finger at the screen. "The Dreadnought's shield generators. If we can take those out, our fleet might stand a chance." Sergeant Hawkins, manning the weapons console, nodded grimly. "Aye, sir, locking on now." The Reliant shuddered as a volley of plasma bolts slammed into its shields, the energy barrier flickering dangerously under the onslaught. Lawrence gritted his teeth as another impact nearly threw him from his seat. "Steady as she goes," he growled. "We're not done yet." But even as he spoke, a new contact flashed onto the sensor display. A small, unmarked ship, moving with uncanny speed and precision through the Andorian formation. Lawrence's blood ran cold as he realized who it must be. "Krytos," he breathed. "That bastard just doesn't know when to quit." The Andorian commander's ship, a sleek prototype stealth fighter, wove through the battle with a deadly grace. Its black hull seemed to absorb the light around it, rendering it all but invisible to the naked eye. But the Reliant's sensors, finely tuned by Dr. Patel's expert hand, picked it out with ease. "He's coming around for another pass," Hawkins warned, his voice tight. Lawrence's hands flew over the controls, sending the Reliant into a dizzying spiral. Plasma bolts sizzled past the viewscreen, so close he could feel their heat through the hull. "Return fire," he barked. "Don't let him get a lock." The two ships danced a deadly waltz, darting and weaving through the chaos of the battle. Volleys of plasma fire streaked between them, scorching hull plates and straining shields to the breaking point. In the Reliance engine room, Dr. Patel worked frantically to keep the ship's systems from failing, his hands a blur over the sparking consoles. But Krytos was relentless. His stealth fighter, a marvel of Andorian engineering, seemed to anticipate the Reliant's every move. Slowly but surely, he wore down the human ship's defenses, each hit taking a greater toll than the last. Alarms blared through the Reliant's corridors as systems failed one by one, the ship shuddering under the unrelenting assault. Lawrence's jaw tightened as he watched the readouts turn an angry red. They couldn't take much more of this. Krytos had them on the ropes, and he knew it. In that moment, a desperate plan crystallized in Lawrence's mind. A last all-or-nothing gambit that might just turn the tide of the battle. He keyed the intercom, his voice steady despite the chaos raging around him. With a defiant roar from its engines, the Reliant surged forward, plunging directly towards the heart of the Andorian dreadnought. Krytos, sensing his prey's intent, accelerated to match, his weapons charging for a final, killing blow. The dreadnought loomed before them, its hull filling the viewscreen. Lawrence could see the flicker of its shields, the pulsing glow of its reactor core. He pushed the engines to their limit, the ship shaking itself apart around him as he lined up his shot. The Reliant punched through the dreadnought's shields like a spear, its reinforced prow crumpling as it slammed into the reactor housing. At the same moment, Krytos' stealth fighter opened fire, its plasma cannons tearing into the Reliant's unprotected flank. The resulting explosion was cataclysmic. A blinding flash of light momentarily outshone the sun as the dreadnought's reactor went critical, the massive ship torn apart from within by the uncontrollable release of energy. The shockwave slammed into the Reliant, sending it tumbling end over end, its hull buckling and twisting under the immense forces. In the heartbeat before the fireball consumed his ship, Lawrence slammed his fist onto the eject button. The command pod blew free of the disintegrating hull, shooting clear of the explosion with barely a second to spare. From the tiny viewports, Lawrence watched as the Reliant, his home and his life for so many years, vanished into the maelstrom of debris and fire. The dreadnought, the pride of the Andorian fleet, was no more. In its place was a rapidly expanding cloud of dust and molten metal, the shock of its destruction rippling through the battle like a stone dropped into a still pond. For a moment, the Andorian ships seemed to falter, their formations wavering as they struggled to comprehend the sudden loss of their flagship. The human fleet, battered but unbroken, seized the moment. With a roar of defiance, they surged forward, plasma cannons and missile batteries opening up on the disoriented Andorians. The alien ships, their coordination shattered, began to break apart under the onslaught. Lawrence, watching from his tumbling escape pod, felt a surge of pride as he saw the human ships pressing their advantage. They had done it. Against all odds, they had turned the tide of the battle. Earth, humanity's cradle, would be safe. But even as he watched the Andorian fleet crumble, a sense of unease settled into his gut. The cost had been high, too high. The Reliant, the ship that had been his home and his life for so long, was gone. And with it, he knew, most of her crew, the men and women who had fought and bled and died under his command. As the last of the Andorian ships winked out, fleeing into the depths of space, a hush fell over the battlefield. The human fleet, victorious but battered, began the grim task of search and rescue, sifting through the debris for survivors. Lawrence, adrift in his escape pod, could only watch and wait. He knew that his story, and the story of the Reliant, would become legend, a rallying cry for a species that had looked into the abyss and refused to blink. But even as he contemplated the future, he couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning. Somewhere out there, in the vast emptiness of space, he knew that the Andorians were licking their wounds, preparing for the next round. And beyond them, in the darkness between the stars, who knew what other threats might be waiting, biding their time? Humanity had won the day, but the war, he knew, was far from over. As he drifted in the silent void, Lawrence steeled himself for the challenges to come. Whatever the future might hold, he would be ready. For Earth, for humanity, and for the memory of the Reliant and all those who had given their lives in her service. You have reached the end of the story. If you enjoyed this story and want to support us, please leave a like and subscribe to our channel, And for every comment that says 88, I will heart every single one of them. Thank you for your time.